All right. Cool. Thank you, everyone for coming. Today, I'm going to talk about sovereignists versus globalists. And here you can also read globalists as effectively statists. So do you want to be sovereign, or do you want to be sort of in a single global security model? And I think fundamentally, the goal of the space is to be sovereign, right? Like, I think very few people came into the space under the idea that, well, we should all rely on the single one world government to control everything we do. It is rather, how do we give users choice about what kind of systems they actually interact with on a very specific day-to-day basis. And I would say that a single decentralized network, no matter how decentralized it is still centralized, right? Like, because we're still in this world of now we have a single failure point. And it doesn't actually matter whether the single failure point is sort of a single server or an actually distributed network of validators. Fundamentally, as long as you have one of something, this is a centralized thing that can be captured, corrupted, can extract rent, and sort of, I think a very good example for why this matters here is like, actually, yeah, just quick show of hands. Who here thinks that a one world government is a good idea? Great, one guy, -1. Fantastic. I like your honesty. This is kind of like if we do not design sovereign systems, but if we design a single decentralized network, and then everything checkpoints into the single decentralized thing, we are still living in this one world government, because fundamentally our trust assumption has to be that hopefully the single decentralized network actually remains decentralized and remains capture-free, but we have very little guarantees for this, and we have very little choice if something happens to it, right? So I think sovereignty is all about choice and giving users the realistic ability to exit a system. Yeah, so a single decentralized network is still centralized. From a physical perspective, and we'll talk about this sort of in the later half of the talk, I would hazard a guess, and this may piss a bunch of people off, that Bitcoin will not survive World War III. This is sort of like, I think on the eve of World War III, we'll lose most fiber and most satellite connectivity, and global consensus is going to become incredibly hard, right? So like the fully global decentralized consensus is actually not super resilient, because it relies on this idea that you must maintain physical connectivity to reach global consensus, right? So in order to actually have truly decentralized sovereign systems, we need to have the ability to sort of be as local as required as well as global as possible, given the underlying networking conditions that emerge sort of over the coming years. From a social perspective, we can always say, well, there's no governance system, there's just rough consensus. Rough consensus can be captured. I think we've seen this mostly in Bitcoin, that Bitcoin has become incredibly stale and doesn't evolve to adapt to sort of the challenges it faces. And especially once you start having on-chain governance, single centralized things, if they do not face external pressure points that compete with them, even if they're decentralized, tend to stagnate, right? So like, you want to give people the ability to move around and to actually like keep the market pressures going, in order to sort of like keep everyone improving at the same time. Yeah, and I think this is sort of, especially my thinking around like a lot of the, well, we should all checkpoint into a single security model. This is sort of with the state channel discussions, a lot of the L2s are like, well, should we really design our security model fundamentally around a single one world government that we all checkpoint into? And I'm not saying that certain amount of standards and interoperability aren't a good idea, but your fundamental economic security maybe shouldn't all rely on the same thing. Because a single security instance can extract rent and harm users. And you must always give users the ability to leave. And I think this is, and so I live in Switzerland, and this is by choice, not sort of by nature. So I like Switzerland a lot because it's a real world example of how credible threats to exit can keep a system that is good for end users. And so if you ever come to Switzerland, let me know, because there's a cool thing where 2 cantons still do hand signal voting in the town square. So once a year they meet up and it's a public vote. They do not have secret elections. It's a public vote where they all stand in the same town square and sort of like decide on the government for the next year, decide on the tax rate for the next year. And this is all like just by hand signal. Also, no one counts. There's a guy in the middle who estimates. And goes like, yes, I think the ayes have it. And if he isn't certain, like if it's an even split, he just gets 4 other guys. And then 5 dudes stand on top of a tower in the middle of a town square and go like, well, we think the ayes have it. But this works fundamentally, right? Because the democracy is so close to the people that there's really not that much unpopular things that sort of a central government, the cantonal governments can do here, because, well, if they do something super unpopular, they can get recalled in the next 6 months, because any sort of referendum can recall them. And so, like, the population has an incredibly effective threat that they generally do not have to take, because sort of the governance system as a whole just is aware of the credible threat of A, being sort of like recalled, and B, you also have this credible threat of exit because you can go to many other places, and the Swiss population is highly mobile. So it's like, and I think this is really what it comes down to. You never want to have to pull the thread, actually. You never want to execute on the threat. Mostly, having the credible threat that you could do something is enough to keep most governance systems in check. And this goes away. For example, if you look at a US election cycle or a German election cycle or a European election cycle, well, because your cycle is 5 years. Like, you can do vastly unpopular things like in the next 4 years after your election, because by the time the next election rolls around, most people will have forgotten about the thing, right? Like, there's no credible threat that keeps everyone in line all the time. And I think this is the other very important thing. Different people want different security models. There's not a single best global security model, and I think this is very important to understand. My parents will never trust global Ethereum. And I would assume this is true for most older people in this room. And to be fair, there's a bunch of special things around, like, my parents trust their local government, they live in Germany, so like they have a good local trust zone. If you live in Argentina, I understand why you may actually trust global Ethereum more than you trust your local Argentinian government, right? But this is not to say that like Argentinian or global Ethereum or German governance is better. It's more different people will have different trust requirements. Because it depends on their specific circumstances, right? And I think we should be designing systems around this, where my parents will want a homogeneous architecture in their local security model. Argentinians will want, ideally, the same homogeneous architecture, but in their local security model. Yeah, so trust is just fundamentally, it's a very personal thing. For example, I very much trust the Swiss government, and not for everything, right? But like, it's a very broad range of like trust models here. And I think actually this is why, especially sort of in like the less stable parts of the world, we're seeing a lot of traction for why blockchain systems are a good alternative. And we're seeing very little uptake in sort of, let's call it sort of the NATO bloc of countries, because fundamentally, most people here trust the local government, whereas most people outside of sort of the West don't trust the local government. And so like, this is like where I think blockchains are starting to be a very appealing security model. Like, my parents do not want a system that the local court system cannot overrule. This is a bad idea for them because they fundamentally trust the local court system. But what we want to enable here is that it is a bad idea if everyone runs their own architecture, because then our applications cannot roam. Like, think about the real-world example of phones. Phones are super nice because I can buy a phone in Switzerland and I can fly to Belgium and it just works. I can fly to China and it still just works. Like, but I'm now roaming different specific security models with the same hardware, with the same app stack. And so this is, I think, kind of the goal of the space of all, that we allow many different heterogeneous trust models, but have a relatively global homogeneous architecture, which is not an intermediary, but rather an interface that we can start sort of developing applications against, so that users, when they want to decide, well, today I'd like to be sort of like use Celestia for DA, and tomorrow I'd like to like do some settlement globally on Ethereum, the same application can just work, and people don't have to buy a new phone in order to use the new settlement layer. Yeah, so don't split the UX. If we start splitting the UX, we'll like arrive in this horrendous world where we all need to carry around like 500 different wallets, because sort of as we roam the world, none of our infrastructure is interoperable anymore. Yeah. So this brings me to sort of the second section of the talk, which is scale-free networks. And this sort of fundamentally comes down to local security models, which is state should only be co-located when it's valuable together. State co-location is really expensive. You're paying for global rounds of consensus. You need to get a global total order over that state. Most state does not require A, global total order, or B, needs to live in the same security model, right? Like, in the sort of the simple example here is like the financial transactions in Brussels do not need to be globally ordered with the financial transactions in Zurich. It's absolute nonsense. And co-locating the state in sort of like a single global thing just makes it incredibly expensive and slow for everyone involved. It is a much better idea that you sort of co-locate all the state that's relevant to Brussels in one instance, co-locate all the state that is relevant to Zurich in another instance, and only when you actually want to have an intersection between these two states, as in like database state, do you actually start co-locating this. So yeah, this is also like the other thing. Once you start having heterogeneous security models, you want to think about how do we build systems that allow you to opt into co-location only when it's needed. As in, you want to have an on-demand sharded system where you go, well, there's like one ANOMA instance running in Zurich, one ANOMA instance running in Brussels, and like whenever you want to do like want to do a synchronous thing between them, only then do you opt into making the relevant state synchronous with the other side. The simple example here is, again, financial transactions. Most stock exchanges are set up this way that there's a total order to the London Stock Exchange, there's a total order to the New York Stock Exchange. There's no global total order that we enforce over all these states because co-located state is fundamentally expensive. So this is also one way to think about who actually owns what state. And fundamentally, always one controller is the controller of a specific piece of state. And generally, you can either have created some state, so then you're sort of the creator or the controller of that created state, or you can currently control a state that someone else created. And the simple example here is actually asset routing over blockchains. In the case of Ethereum, right? Ethereum is the creator of all ETH. Like Ethereum can always sort of inflate the supply, slash everyone. Ethereum has full sovereignty over what happens to the asset of ETH, over this database state that we have assigned the semantic meaning of being ETH. If you start moving ETH to another system, to a rollup, well, now it's in two places. But what happens when you actually want to move it from Optimism to Arbitrum? Well, honestly, you should route this back via Ethereum, because this is actually the fundamental controller that's going to determine what is the correct state of ETH anyway. And this also comes all down to scalability. If everyone routes their own state and is sort of the final controller for their own state, this is an incredibly scalable model, because we don't have to have like these large routing points that everyone trusts. It's rather, well, if you want to hold ETH, I assume you trust the global Ethereum is secure. And then you have that trust assumption anyway. And if you then start thinking about doing this routing via sort of the thing that created, the controller that created that state, it just makes your security model much easier, and it makes it much more scalable. And yeah, again, then users and applications can actually roam between these many different instances. So yeah, this is sort of the point. Every community, and this is really communities here, whether physical or digital, right? Like people think about communities really in the physical sense, but you should also think about this in the digital sense, where like the World of Warcraft community is an actual cohesive community that should probably co-locate their state. We already sort of covered the blockchain. Oh, damn, I'm also running low on time. Great. So the super nice extension of scale-free networks is that everyone can end up being their own chain. Because fundamentally, if you create valuable state in these systems, you should become sort of the control, like you are the control of the state. And so this means that we can get rid of this like weird abstraction, which is like there's some blockchain in the sky over there, and I interact with this blockchain in the sky via some RPC nodes, to rather, well, we all sit on the same level. I'm just a one-on-one blockchain that controls some local state that is like relevant to me, that is my personal data. And whenever I want to route this to the rest of the world, I can route this on exactly the same underlying sort of software protocols that we also use on the chain-to-chain communication basis. So individuals are really just controllers of their own state. They're one-of-one instances. They're effectively single instances with a single validator. And this is incredibly powerful once you start thinking about this in a generalized fashion, that we get rid of all these weird abstractions where, well, users are a different class. They have different levels of access. They must run RPC nodes. They can't just interact on the same P2P network that actually all the validators interact on. They must sit on a separate thing. And once you start thinking about this in terms of scale-free networks, you end up in this world where really you just have a homogeneous group of people that all just that you can describe really well in the same abstraction. And coming back to this, fundamentally, right? The goal of the space is to build World War III resilient infrastructure. I think, at least I hope, Because I think when a lot of people think, well, we want to build decentralized systems, what are we actually doing this for? And I think the honest answer is we want to be more resilient than right now, because our current systems are incredibly brittle. And this comes down to a couple of things. Mostly, all our existing infrastructure was built around this Pax Americana idea that, well, we have a single global security model and the US government is going to secure our entire financial system. This is clearly breaking. And by the way, I'm not in favor of this breaking. Pax Americana is great, and we should all pray that this lasts as long as possible, because the alternative is incredibly messy. But we should sort of think about what are actual decentralized systems for? How can we build infrastructure that makes sort of this probably future outcome less messy for us? And this really comes down to the infrastructure we build around Pax Americana, especially around the financial system, will not survive World War III. It will not survive a global internet outage, because especially in Europe, if we lose most North Atlantic fiber cables, the European financial system just grinds to a halt. I also assume that the Swiss financial system is not going to survive a dedicated cyber attack, because it was never designed with that model in mind. This is sort of just something that came on later. So yeah, my assumption is that on day one of World War III, global connectivity is immediately lost, and all global consensus is shot. So we aren't going to live in the world where it's well, everything broke around us, but we can still totally get to 12-second block times on global consensus to move some magic internet money around, right? This seems very unlikely to exist in practice, to happen in practice, mostly because most fiber is going to get cut and most satellites are going to drop out of the sky. So you really got to start thinking, well, we want to have infrastructure that is as local as required, but as global as possible, so that, let's say we lose connectivity to everyone outside of this room, we can still have the same infrastructure, the same tech stack to do local settlement. And this is, I focus here really on the point of resilience, but it's also the point of latency. If we in this room just want to do trading, no global consensus will ever be faster than a local connectivity. Unless you can violate the laws of physics, you will never get faster than local fiber to fiber connectivity, right? This is just a fundamental point of physics at the moment, at least, that no matter how fast Solana makes global consensus, it will never be faster than us running things locally. And in trading, this really matters, right? It's about latency as well as about sort of state co-location. The other thing is, when you think about World War III resilient infrastructure, you got to be thinking about privacy, because fundamentally privacy is needed for community defense. And sometimes I talk about this in terms of privacy for national defense, because I think this is a much more positive way to think about privacy guarantees. It is not that you're trying to hide from the government. It's more as a government, you do not want to leak all your data to North Korea. This is very much the case that I think no sane country is going to support a completely transparent global financial system. Because sort of on day two, everyone goes wait, what? North Korea is just doing massive amounts of data analysis over everyone's financial transactions? That actually seems like a bad idea, right? So we need infrastructure that is both local as required, as global as possible, as well as that has decent privacy guarantees at the base layer. And then the best case really is for local connectivity. And once you start having this, the way you should start thinking about these protocols is you actually want the ability to make this very transparent from a user perspective, again, where users can easily roam depending on what the physical connectivity practically allows you to do, right? If you happen to have global consensus, great, then you can use global instances. If you only have local consensus, also fine, your same infrastructure works. As a side note, if you're sitting in this room, most likely you're in charge of providing local data centers to your local community. And this is sort of, I think, just going to be a hard requirement going forward if you want to have resilient infrastructure. We can't be relying on oh, some RPC server will be available to someone to host me a frontend, right? So if you're in this room, please start running local Ethereum nodes, start running local Celestia nodes, host your own Uniswap frontends. And this doesn't have to be big, right? 2 Raspberry Pis in a closet somewhere is actually already the right step. But really in this space, if we actually care about decentralization, we should fundamentally care about not all relying on the same inferior RPCs, because this will just not work in the future. Yeah, and this is really run everything over LAN. Oh, this is actually the coolest thing. I will quickly talk about this. Every community must run their own infrastructure just because you need to be fully decoupled from global state. And yeah, please self-host. So in Zug, I was bored at some point when I moved there. I was like, oh, I should find out some local, I should meet some local people. And so I looked into the ham radio club. And ham radio is just amateur radio. And so you go to the website, and the first thing on the website is a charter by the Canton of Zug that says, you must provide backup emergency comms within 6 hours of an outage. So that local ham radio club in Zug is charged with dedicated infrastructure, with an emergency response in case Zug loses power. So what actually happens is all the members of the ham radio club just have backup generators in their cars, and when they get power outages, if they get a canton-wide power outage, the idea is that they drive up to the mountain peaks to provide local area coverage that's independent of any centrally run infrastructure to get emergency backup comms for emergency services. And this is really the right way to think about this. This is why I think Switzerland is a great example. The Swiss are fucking paranoid. And honestly, the blockchain space should learn more from the Swiss because they've been paranoid for way longer than we've been around. And they thought more about how do you actually get resilient infrastructure going. And by the way, if you're into shitcoin trading, that's great. But I think this is not the talk for you. I'm very much into how do we actually build long-term resilient systems here using some of the cool distributed systems tech that we're building out at the moment. Yeah, so quick TLDR. Single decentralized networks are still centralized. We want to have choice. We want to have we want to have optionality so that single things can't get corrupted. A single global security model is fucking terrifying. We should not be building for this. Single things of everything are going to get corrupted. They're going to extract rent. They're not going to do the fun, nice cryptography that you actually like, right? It's also about user choice and adaptability. Fundamentally, different users have different preferences for their own security. And we need many independent security models that actually can compete with each other. Fundamentally, you want to be thinking about building scale-free networks that have homogeneous architectures as well as heterogeneous security models because you want to give individuals the ability to roam. Also, I didn't speak too much about this, but stakeholder privacy really, really matters. If you aren't thinking about how to build privacy preserving, how do you give the ability to have some amount of privacy within a system at the base layer, I think that base layer will, it's very difficult to get global traction because most users fundamentally care. My parents will never use a system where their neighbors see their bank account balance because this is just something incredibly alien to them. Yeah, we should also learn from the internet. The internet was actually designed really well. And if you're in the audience and thinking about decentralization of DNS, I know there are problems with the internet that we didn't solve back in the day. But fundamentally, I remember the internet not as a I remember networking not as a thing I reach out to the internet, but I bring my computer and a switch to a friend's house, and we run things over LAN, without ever touching the internet. This is sort of the model that I grew up in, and I think this is the model that we should learn from in terms of being able to run physical infrastructure. Fundamentally, we should be thinking about how we build World War III resilient infrastructure, not because we want to bet on this happening, right? But because it's the right mental model to actually build truly decentralized, truly resilient systems. Yeah, and architectures, protocols must work, even when there's no global connectivity. Thank you very much. This was Sovereignty versus Sovereignists versus Globalists.